so much. I'm so glad to see all of you. In a second here, we're going to dig into the Word, and I think the message today has some really powerful things to say to us. But first, I'm going to pray really quick again. I know that we just did that. That's okay, because you can't pray too much if you're in a church, I think. So if you would go ahead and bow with me again. Lord, thank you so much again for today, for the opportunity that we have to gather and to worship, to look into your word together. We just ask that you would bless our time, bless our study, and Lord, most of all, we ask that your word would encourage us to not only become better followers of you, but better servants of each other. We ask that you would encourage us where we need encouraging, empower us where we need empowering to imitate and obey you more today than we did yesterday. Amen. All right, so the latest saga in the Anderson household has been a couple of cats that we got a few months ago. They're pretty cute, they're pretty cuddly. That's a picture of them up there. They are absolute terrorists, so do not let that picture fool you. This picture is a lie, guys. Because they do this for about a quarter of their day, and then the rest of the day is spent completely beating the stuffing out of each other, right? Chasing each other around the house, on the back of the couch, rolling on the floor, up on the bed, back off the bed, down the hall, the other way, the whole way, right? They are absolutely bloodthirsty terrorists. So a few weeks ago, we had a little situation where we were trying to get ready in the morning, and so Stephanie's got the girls running around doing their chores, and I'm kind of trying to do stuff, get ready for work and whatever, and that means that Mortal Kombat is happening underneath your feet, right? So you're doing this kind of thing as you're trying to move around. And me, I responded to this in the absolute most mature, rational, and not in any way juvenile way you can think of, and I kind of got mad at him, and I'm like, you little tickle farts! Yeah, I made up a word, okay, dinkle farts, great, go home, repeat the other one, kids don't get in trouble with your mom, very mild profanity, right? But Stephanie kind of gave me this exasperated look, like, what are you doing? What's wrong? She goes, do you have to do that? What are you talking about? Like, no, do what? Make up weird names for stuff. Why do you do that? Well, because it's kind of true, right? And it's funny, I guess, I don't know. And she goes, what do you mean? How could it possibly be true? Like, I'm looking at them as they're like, across the floor. I'm like, have you seen them? And she goes, seen what? Like, first off, you need to tell me, what is a dinkle fart? And how do my muffins look like them? And I was like, muffins? What are you talking about? I'm talking about cats, right? It turned out that this conversation is happening right in the middle of Stephanie explaining to the girls what's going to be for breakfast. Her little mini muffins, and she had gotten the word little out before my much bigger voice from across the room goes, little dinkle farts, right? And that is like, what? So obviously it's a pretty it's dumb, right? This miscommunication is stupid. This is not the kind of thing that's gonna put a wedge between Stephanie and I. Even if we never resolve that conversation, this is not something that's gonna drive us apart, right? It's silly, but it's not hard to imagine things that are kind of that way, right? Where you do have harsh words and bad attitudes and things like that over time and kind of compiled on top of each other, they add up to quite a bit, right? And we're going to talk about some verses today that I think are going to help with that. So we're going to get into those practical ways that God gives us to avoid this sort of miscommunication. But first, I'm going to do something that I don't do very often, or ever really, but I know is very powerful. I'm going to ask you guys to stand with me, please, and we're going to read today's passage together. It's Philippians 2:12 through 18. It says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Thank you. You guys can go ahead and sit down. As Penny mentioned, if you are anything at all like me, you probably saw a couple words in there that kind of automatically started some warning bells at chiming. Guys, I was raised a good Bible-believing conservative Baptist boy, okay? When I hear the words work and salvation in the same sentence, this is a no-no, okay? And in fact, it automatically starts my shields up, red alert, this is a big problem, right? No good. And it would be that way if this passage was written in a complete vacuum, right? If all we had was that verse, that would look a little heretical, probably, because it's basically throwing out the rest of the gospel in order to make that point. But it's not in a vacuum, right? This verse is actually part of one larger story, one larger letter that was written for a very specific purpose, and it has a point, and that verse is not going to contradict the point of that passage, right? So we're going to dig into this. We're going to try to figure out how that happened and why he's saying what he's saying. So first we're going to start with the very first word of the passage was therefore. Well, if you ever see therefore in Scripture, the very first question you should be asking is, what is the therefore, right? Following? That word clues us in that what the author's about to say is directly connected to whatever came right before it. Well, what came right before it? In this case, it was what Barry had to say just a couple weeks ago. Paul told us in the first few verses of the chapter to remind us to be of one mind. We're to be totally unified in doing nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourselves. And immediately after that, Skylar did a great job last week of going through the verses that immediately followed right before this, where it said, hey, Christ is going to be the best way for you to do that. Imitate Christ, and that's how you're going to accomplish what Barry said, right? So Christ did not think equality with God was something that you could grasp, even though he was God. There's a conundrum. He emptied himself completely, became servant to all, humbled himself more than anybody has ever humbled themselves before, right? All the way from creator and king of the universe to being tortured to death on a cross. And he did all of it in obedience to God's will. Therefore, as you have always obeyed, just like Christ did, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Guys, I don't think work out your own salvation here. He's not saying work for your salvation. Remember, this letter is written to people that are already in a church. It's assumed that they are all believers already, right? They've already been saved. Instead, he's saying work from your salvation. Work out from your salvation. You are showing the world that you have been saved. And if you don't believe me, just look at verse 13 there. It says that you are supposed to be doing this work because it is God who works in you. God's doing the saving. God's doing the miracles, the hard work. All you have to do is be obeying, right? You are demonstrating to the world that God is at work in you when you demonstrate your salvation. Well, how are we going to go about doing that? What's remarkable is how we're called to obey. Verse 14 says that we're supposed to do everything without grumbling or complaining, disputing. You can actually read that disputing there as a bad attitude. The word actually means thoughts. Okay, obviously in context, negative thoughts, okay, so bad attitudes, right? Which is a good thing, right? I mean, that's great. If I had, I love, guys, the notion of doing everything without grumbling or complaining. That's like, and bad attitudes and all that stuff, that's like every mom's favorite verse, right? Like, it's probably been pinned on 2/3 of the refrigerators in this church at one point or another, and it's great, it's good. We need that, right? But I don't think I would put that on my list of, like, top deadly sins that we need to avoid at all costs, right? Why these ones? Well, I think what happens is we need to keep in mind a little bit where Paul is when he's writing these verses, okay? Paul has been sitting in prison. He's been there for years at this point. In fact, he's chained up to one of those guys every single waking second of his life, right? You got to go to the bathroom, you're getting this guy to go with you, right? All of that. He's not allowed to leave his house, okay? He's been there for so long, in fact, that he has to get guys like Epaphroditus to come and be a gopher for him. It takes 3 months, probably, to go from where Epaphroditus is to Rome, where Paul's at, and then give him a letter, give him some news, bring him a jacket, bring him some food or whatever, and then 3 months back with a letter from Paul to the church. And he's having to do that with all of the churches that he's talking to. And by the way, guys, Paul does not like writing these letters. He does not like writing these letters. He was called specifically by God to go plant churches in Jesus Christ's name. And you're sitting in prison having to write dumb letters to these people that you've already planted and all that. You're not even able to do the work that God called you to do. Can you imagine how frustrating that is? And you're being prevented from doing that work for completely unjust reasons. That's got to really be a source of, I can see why you would be complaining. You would have reasons to feel resentful. On top of that, that's not even the worst. He has a group of people called the Judaizers that are running around. I don't know if you know what those guys are, but they are supposedly believers of Jesus that think that if you're going to follow Christ as closely as possible, it means that you have to follow all of the old Jewish law. Okay? Instead, what Paul says is, well, maybe you actually should behave like Christ and have your attitude like Christ and, let Christ work through you, not you try to save yourself through the law. Well, these guys want Paul dead because of that. They're writing all these nasty polemics, these hit pieces to all the churches that Paul planted, trying to convince them to turn away from Paul, right? They're actually sending these letters to the authorities, the Roman government, and trying to convince them that, hey, this guy is a threat, this guy is dangerous, you should have him exiled, or better yet, just execute him. That's why he's in prison, partially, right? And the churches that Paul has so lovingly worked to plant, they're not having a whole lot better time of things either. In fact, in this particular one in Philippi, we have a situation where 2 prominent ladies within the church that someone's going to be talking about next week, Euodia and Syntyche, have some sort of argument. And we don't know exactly what their argument is about, but we know what the effects are. It is threatening to shred this church, right? And this is not like church splits today. Today, church splits are bad enough, right? They're ugly, they're messy, that it's never pretty. But you could go from the Baptist Street or church on Ash Street to the Baptist church on Birch Street, and it kind of works out, right? Like, it's okay. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. This is the only church they have. If it gets ripped to shreds, it's done. Okay, so there's some hard feelings there, and also they've got other hard feelings. The government wants them gone. And that's been true since Paul first showed up in Philippi. You remember the story of the slave girl that had a demon that would allow them to predict the future and was making her owners tons of money, and Paul chucked the demon out, and these guys lost a ton of money? They've hated the church ever since, right? That hasn't improved. It's only gotten worse. The church at Philippi is not in very good standing with the government because they keep running counter to them. Guys, they have reasons to complain. They have reasons to feel bitter about their circumstances. They have reasons to actually allow resentment. And they're not wrong. That's the interesting thing. When we have complaints, when we have bad attitudes and things like that, the stuff that is causing those bad attitudes and those complaints, they may be 100% justified. But it's not going to produce what Paul is telling us that we need. Those attitudes, those complaints, no matter how justified they are, will never produce the sort of righteousness or humble, God-honoring service or other-centered focus that we are called to. It just won't. In fact, grumbling, complaining, quarreling, bad attitudes, all that stuff is nothing but the fuel that feeds that slow burn of bitterness and resentment. It eats you up from inside. Think about the people that you know that dwell in bitterness. And we all know people that do this, right? We all know people that do this, where they have some hurt from way back when that they haven't really been able to let go, and then they end up, pull it out whenever they get the chance, right? And share it every single time it comes. These aren't happy people. Did they get that way just because that one event, they woke up and they had the bad day and then it just sort of stuck? No, they didn't. They got that way by kind of treating it nicely, right? Like you stoked the fire and you kept it alive and you purposefully sort of, kept it going. It's a pattern of behavior. Now that person is probably a pretty extreme example. I don't think there's a whole lot of people in this church that are that way because people don't really like being around those people very much. I think what happens, though, more commonly is the what I call low-level gripe, right? Where, and you know exactly what this stuff is, where the person in the grocery aisle in front of you is taking way too long. It's like, come on, I don't have time for this, right? You have cats that are tripping you up in between your feet, You've got the guy that cuts you off in traffic. You have the person that merges onto the highway 25 miles an hour slower than everybody else. You've got all these little things, right? Drive through downtown Portland. I promise you will find something to complain about. Politics, gas prices. Oh, politics. You're not talking about something that can change the air or the temperature in a room like that. Yeah, that'd be that one. And people are not always wrong to complain about some of that stuff, right? On a more personal level, what about relationships between you and your spouse, between your husband and your wife? How easy is it to have something that hasn't been working very right or well, and you just kind of slow burn in the background? When you're with your friends, you can talk about them and you can totally run them down because it's really easy and they're not there to argue with you, right? That is something that is really, really easy to do. And I found myself when I was studying for all this going, oh my gosh, I complained way more than I thought I did. Right? I thought I was a pretty reasonable, no, guys, no. I found more complaints in life than boy, I sound like a jerk. I need to get nicer. Guys, if you are griping about your spouse, just think about how that works, right? Is that going to be more likely or less likely to make that relationship get better? Is it going to be more likely to allow you to forgive any future slights? Or is it going to be less likely? If you're hanging on to that kind of stuff and you're just packing it away and keeping track of a scorecard, it's going to get really ugly in very short order. It doesn't take very long, and it's very insidious. And that's with the most important relationship that you could possibly have with another mortal here on earth, right? Imagine what that's like for somebody that's just like your coworker, right? How quickly that's going to go. I think the reason why verse 12 tells us to continue humbly imitating Christ without complaining or grumbling, with fear and trembling, is because you wield enormous power with your attitude. It ought to concern us, right? That we can completely undercut the gospel with our attitudes alone. It's not an accident that Paul says by avoiding grumbling and complaining and these bad attitudes, you will be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine like lights in the world. Your attitude will mark you as different. When I was still teaching, I had experiences all the time. Every year, every single class that I taught, there was at least one kid that I could tell, without even talking to them, that kid is a dedicated believer of Jesus. Just because of the way they handled stuff. Yeah, I know nobody likes this assignment, right? Everybody else is complaining about it, but not you, right? That kid buckled down and was like, I guess that's what we gotta do. The way these other kids are behaving, they're kind of jerks sometimes, right? And the way that you handle those kids that are sort of jerks around you, and you just sort of, hey, no, you know what, they're just being them, and I'm going to be nice to them even if they're not very nice to me. I can't describe exactly what that is. I don't know, it's hard to put it into words, but they have a grace about them that is just obvious to anybody that's watching. And I'm positive that if you talk to any of the teachers that are in this room, they would tell you they have the exact same experience. And by the way, that's not true of every single kid that you know that goes to church, because it turns out that attitude is a Christ-like attitude. Not everybody that goes to church has a Christ-like attitude, right? But every person that has that Christ-like attitude definitely goes to church. It's also not an accident that Paul says that people with that Christ-like attitude will shine like lights in the world. And the phrase here in Greek is literally shine like stars. And this is something that's really interesting to me. Our Western culture likes to personalize everything and individualize it. So we're going, oh, if I obey Christ, then I will be the little twinkling star, right? And I will shine in the night sky, which is true. That's good. That's awesome. We used to teach kids all the time, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. That's a fantastic song. You should do that. I think you should shine for God's glory wherever you go. But keep in mind, this passage is being written to an actual church, okay? So a single star in the nighttime sky, if you can see that up there. Not particularly impressive, is it? It's just a dot. That's cool. I mean, it's billions of miles away, and it's a giant ball of fire that you can see. That's pretty neat. But have you ever seen the entire Milky Way galaxy at once? If you get out away from city lights, if you get out in the country, I don't know if you ever go deer hunting or backpacking or any of that kind of stuff, get away from the city and look up on a clear night sky, and it literally looks like that, guys. That's what Paul's talking about. I don't think it's possible to see that without getting completely blown away. And when you have a church where everybody is doing that, working out their salvation because God is at work in them, this is what it looks like. We're not going to accomplish this by simply telling ourselves, if you can't say anything nice at all, don't say anything, right? That's a great principle, but that doesn't actually fix anything in here, does it? Burying a bad attitude that you have underneath like a forced good attitude, that's not going to fix anything either. Because you need actual heart change. We all do. It's only going to be accomplished by carefully and purposefully doing something different than what we are used to. We have to do the opposite of griping and complaining and bad attitudes. Which would be something like doing nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourselves. Or maybe having this mindset among yourselves, to be like Christ, who emptied himself to become a servant, humbled himself all the way to a cross. Guys, that's a Christ-like attitude. It means building each other up with your words, with your actions, and maybe most importantly, with your thoughts and with your attitudes, because that's the one that's going to steer the other two, right? It's going to determine what you say and what you do. If your attitude's no good, at some point, that's coming out. And what does that really look like in a practical sense? I mean, as a church, or when I think of Cornerstone, we are a serving church. We always have been. It's wonderful. It's awesome. I love it. We have done a fantastic job of doing that. And we are not a complaining church. Have you ever been part of a complaining church? Ugh. I have, okay? It is no fun. It is no good, and it is not a pretty picture. But we do have people at this church who have faithfully served in their roles for pushing 20 years now, right? And they don't do it for recognition, they don't do it for thanks. In fact, they get very little of it. That's not the reason why they're doing it, but they also don't get people stepping up and saying, hey, let me help you with that. That doesn't happen terribly often. And you're not getting any condemnation from me, by the way, if that's not you, because I'm totally right there with you guys. I got a drink of water this morning and just chugged it down, and then I stopped as I was walking away. I was like, there's got to be like 10 gallons worth of drinks over here, between coffee and juice and water and all that other stuff. I have no idea who actually puts that stuff over there every single week. No clue. And if that is you, by the way, I'm not raining on you either, because without you doing that kind of thing, this church doesn't run. I mean, think about all the things that have to get done. All this stuff gets packed up in trailers and it's all in crates and boxes and all this stuff. All these cables and I don't know if you can see this over here. There's like 1,000,007 cables that are all plugged into something over there. Someone has to do that every single Sunday, right? All the signs, all the decorations, things out in the parking lot, kids club stuff. All these things have to get done, right? And there's opportunities there for people to serve, and it's fantastic, it's wonderful when people are serving, but I think there's also opportunities for us to look around and go, man, maybe I can jump in and do more than I am. Think of it this way, with the drinks over here, when was the last time I stopped and said, hey, who does run that? And then go find them and say, thank you so much for what you do. That's really important to me. Not very often. Worse than that, when was the last time that me, a relatively young, strong of back, if not particularly of mind person, went out of my way to volunteer to actually help doing stuff like that? Ooh. Okay. There's a zillion things that need work around here that people have to do. And we have a lot of the same people that are serving in a lot of the same roles, and that's wonderful. They are faithful servants of God. And I thank them so much from the bottom of my heart, because this church doesn't operate without you. But I also look and say, we are really good at serving when we know there's a need. When somebody's moving, when somebody needs help doing this, that, and the other thing, we will go out and do that when we know there's a need. And my heart would be that we would look for those needs before we're told that they're needs, right? That we as a church would be interested in coming together and serving the Lord together, and I know we're not doing this on purpose. Nobody is sitting back and just expecting to get served. Nobody's doing that. Nobody is doesn't care that other people are working hard. That's just not it. But I do think that if we were focused on that and actually thinking about that, can you imagine what church would be like? Just take little things like Kids Club, for example. Kids Club is awesome. We have awesome kids at this church. I don't know if you've heard that kind of repeatedly through the service, but our teenagers, our little kids, everybody is really, really cool. What an opportunity to go hang out with the coolest kids. I mean, if that was a classroom in a public school, that would be the best classroom you could possibly have, right? They're awesome little kids. And it wouldn't be that hard to do because it only takes 2 services a week to run Kids Club. It's every other week, right? So if 4 people stepped up and offered to orchestrate Kids Club and just split it up between themselves, that means each person has to only serve once every other month. It's not that huge of a job. But people often, I think, they have a tendency to say, oh, well, my giftings aren't in that area. I'm not really good at that. I'm not a teacher. I don't know how to do kids stuff or whatever. Which could be true, right? You probably know your gifting better than I do. But on the other hand, does anybody actually think that those 8-year-olds in Kid Club are going to go home and tell mom and dad, well, Kids Club would have been pretty good. But that person running it today, they have a seriously questionable grasp of biblical pedagogy. I don't think that's going to happen, right? So which is more important? Is it more important to wait to volunteer until we make absolutely sure that every single person that's serving in every single role is perfectly gifted to be in that role? Or is it more important to maybe just jump in and start doing the stuff that needs to be done and just trust that God's going to take that faithfulness and is going to honor it, right? I'm pretty sure that God will not allow a job that has been done with the right heart to the very best of what might be absolutely mediocre ability and let it be wasted. That's the end of that verse. That I know that I did not labor in vain. You don't labor in vain. Even if you're not the greatest at your job, it's okay, right? You're serving the Lord, and that's what he wants. Church, those are the takeaways today. If you remember nothing else about today, I hope and I pray that you remember that your attitude has unimaginable power. You have within yourself the ability to demonstrate the gospel to anyone and everyone around you with your very life. Conversely, you also have the ability to completely cut the hamstrings out of the gospel before it's even gotten out of the gate with just your attitude. Does that make sense? Guys, that's the fear and trembling, isn't it? Holy moly. If my attitude is what hinders the gospel from being spread, I am now standing directly in opposition to it. That should be terrifying. And also the opposite of a bad attitude. It's not just a good attitude. It's definitely not when a good attitude is forced and fake. The opposite is to have a Christ-like attitude, which, as we've seen, means to think as Christ thought, to do as Christ did, empty ourselves to become servants, humble ourselves in obedience to God, even if it kills us. The good news is I don't think it's going to kill you here. But it is kind of sometimes hard to do, isn't it? Because if we have an attitude that is focused on Christ and imitating Christ, it's going to be an attitude that lifts everyone up. And then the church that's most effective for the kingdom is the church which keeps those Christ-like attitudes as a priority in everything that they do. I think we do a pretty darn good job around that here at Cornerstone. That was what this church was founded to do. And all I'm doing is just encouraging you guys to continue doing what we know we were here for from the beginning. That's a church whose every word, every action, their every thought is going to be focused on living out the gospel. That church becomes a beacon, an absolute beacon to anybody that sees it. And it absolutely is just as impressive as that whole Milky Way galaxy is. When you see a whole church that's clicking that way, oh my goodness gracious, what could be done for the gospel? It's amazing. I challenge you to reflect on that, church. I know that no one here means to take anything for granted. We're not purposefully sitting back and expecting to be served. When Steph and I first came to Cornerstone, that was what brought us here and kept us here, was that this was one of the very first churches I have ever been to that took a nobody like me and said, hey, come join us. We need your help. Right? They invited me to stand in the gap, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, if you want to think of it that way, and meet the needs of people as they arose in a Christ-like manner. And not only that, this was the first church I have ever been to where the people that were running the show, that were in charge of all these different roles and things, they purposefully were working to empower, train, and replace themselves. That's awesome. That never happened. That is Christ at work, right? The good news, guys, is that because we're a church that does this for the most part, you have some outstanding ways to observe Christ at work around you today, even. We've already talked about how the youth kids are going to be running the harvest party. That's amazing. I don't know if you have any idea how much work goes into that. Caleb has done an awesome job of grabbing teenagers, helping them figure out what they're going to do. Some of these kids have their cars, like the back of them, just stuffed with things, activities, candy, all this fun stuff. They're going to set it all up, they're going to run it, they're going to tear it all down for the most part, just so that kids who are smaller than them can have a fun afternoon. That is church. Somebody is going to be serving pizza over there. I don't know how many pizzas there are, 850. So someone had to go pick them up from the store and bring them. Someone else has to stand there and hand out all the slices. Somebody else has to take them up. There's all these things. The tables have to get moved around. All these different things. Somebody did that. And that is church. That is awesome. Nobody's asking for things. Great. You served because Christ asked you to and is at work in you. Guys, that is fantastic. That's church. And that's the sort of thing that this passage is reminding us to look for ways to do more of. Actively look for ways to demonstrate the gospel, to demonstrate our salvation by imitating Christ in everything that he did, in all of his attitudes, serving each other and serving everybody else. Guys, if we can do that, this church will shine so brightly, I don't think anybody could help but notice. Let's go ahead and pray really quick, guys. Lord, we thank you again for who you are. Your desire to use weak, flawed, and selfish people such as us to reveal yourself, your glory, your grace, and your love to the world. We're so grateful for the opportunity to be part of the work that you have ordained from the very beginning of time itself. I can't comprehend the honor that you have chosen to give us by allowing us to be part of that work, despite our weakness. I pray, Lord, that you would encourage those of us who are serving to continue to serve faithfully, and encourage those of us who maybe could do more to be proactive in their faith and take steps to start looking for ways to just jump right in. We pray that you would point out to us our attitudes. Remind us when we falter, Lord, that we might earnestly work to represent you more fully to those that are around us. We pray, Lord, that you would create a heart within each of us that seeks to place others above ourselves. We look for ways that we could actively humble ourselves by lightening each other's burdens. In the mighty, mighty name of Jesus Christ.